An officer first assumed a call from a 3-year-old was a joke when he received it, but he hurries because he knows you can't ignore an emergency. And what he discovers there makes him sick to his stomach. Is that a kid playing, or is something more terrible happening? Okay, let's hear it. Moreover, please inform us from what location you are listening. The late October day in Maplewood, a little town where everyone knew one another, was blurred as the rain pounded on the glass of patrol car Daniel Dan Hayes. Although Maplewood is often a peaceful place, the constant rain tonight made it seem more tense. Dan, a 20-year veteran of the Maplewood Police Department, was worn out. Even with the car's warmth turned up to 11, he felt the aches and pains of the wet cold seeping into his outfit. He was eagerly anticipating the conclusion of his shift, a steaming plate of food, and the soothing solitude of his little abode. However, his radio started crackling to life just as he was ready to unwind. Possible domestic disturbance at 123 Elm Avenue. Caller is a 3-year-old male. Frown was Dan's expression. Is that a 3-year-old on the phone? A kid fiddling with the phone, or a practical joke would have had to have caused it. However, his gut reaction kicked in due to the dispatcher's voice, which exhibited a combination of incredulity and worry. He couldn't ignore it. After 20 years on the job, Dan knew better than to downplay the gravity of any call, particularly involving a minor. The sound of his siren pierced through the rain's relentless beating as he turned it on. A row of nice single-family houses bordered Elm Avenue in this peaceful neighborhood. A little white cottage with a rusted swing set in the rear, a neglected flower bed, and the number 1, 2, 3 came into view as he drove up. As Dan got out of his vehicle, the cold rain splattered his uniform all over his skin, and a wave of unease washed over him as he saw a wrecked tricycle lying on the sidewalk. With his palm trembling over his holster, Dan approached the front door with caution. Muted noises emanating from inside sent a chill down his spine, a whimper, a gentle sob, and a repetitive pounding. With an air of confidence and authority, he rapped on the door. "An officer, please, come out." For an instant, he was met with quiet. Suddenly, a timid voice, just discernible through the rain, whispered, "Let me guess." Dan crouched down, bringing himself up to the height of the doorknob. "Hello, this is Dan, a police officer. Would you mind letting me in?" A few inches of creaking opened the door when the lock clicked. Peeking out were blue eyes brimming with tears. Holding a battered teddy bear, a little boy, no more than 3 years old, strode about, his forehead adorned with stray blonde hair and his face marked with grime and tears. "Do you possess any injuries?" Dan's voice softened as he asked. A quivering lip accompanied the boy's head shake. "Absolutely not. However, Grandpa has fallen and is now unresponsive." An adrenaline rush washed over Dan. There was no joke here. He forcefully opened the door and entered the house, surveying the living room in an instant. There was a solitary old guy stretched out on the floor. The aroma of wet wool, and something else, was pervasive in the air. The little metallic aroma made Dan's stomach turn. With his keen eyesight, he quickly made his way to the man's side. A frail and sickly Mr. Robert Miller was out cold. He was laboring to breathe. The faded carpet was stained a deep scarlet as a puddle of blood steadily spread under his head. Dan's heart rate increased. He felt for a pulse, and it was feeble and thready. Taking his radio by the horn, he yelled, "At 123 Elm Avenue, an officer is in need of help, possibly a man who is unconscious and has head trauma, urging for urgent medical assistance." The terrified young kid stared at Dan through wide eyes as he held on tight to his teddy bear. "Can we be sure Grandpa will be all right?" He muttered so softly that it was scarcely audible. Dan smiled artificially reassuringly, but his stomach knotted with anxiety. "We will ensure that he is well taken care of." Despite the seriousness of the situation, he attempted to sound cool and collected. Dan calmly guided the youngster to a weathered couch in the room's corner as paramedics burst in, their motions quick and trained. He saw a landline phone resting on a table next to him, with the receiver hanging loosely from the hook. "Are you in contact?" "What's going on?" Dan inquired of the youngster. With a nod, the young man seemed to agree. "Mommy taught me how," he murmured, a little burst of pride briefly masking the terror in his eyes. "I need to give them our address and my name in case anything goes wrong." It shocked Dan. Even though he was too scared to do much more than tie his shoelaces, this tiny kid summoned the courage to cry out for assistance. In doing so, he may have spared his grandfather's life. Dan bent down before the youngster and looked into his eyes. "You showed tremendous courage, my son. Your work was excellent." The youngster smeared dirt on his nose as he sniffled and wiped it with the sleeve of his pajamas. With his voice choked with emotions, he murmured, "I simply wanted to assist Grandpa." Admiration and protectiveness surged through Dan. "You're an inspiration, Liam," he said gently. Dan sat down next to Liam after making sure the paramedics were attending to Mr. Miller. From what he could tell, Liam's grandparents were looking after him, while his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Miller, were away on a long business trip abroad. Mr. Miller's current symptoms of lightheadedness and weakness were related to his history of cardiac issues. It seemed as if he had passed out and banged his skull on the coffee table. Later on in the hospital, when Dan talked with Mr. Miller, the old man was awake but drowsy and bewildered. "Liam rescued you," Dan informed him. "That guy was courageous." Awe and thankfulness shone through Mr. Miller's feeble voice. "He follows in his mother's footsteps, a good boy and a smart cookie." Dan paid close attention as Mr. Miller elaborated on their predicament. Working as entrepreneurs had always been a way of life for the Millers, requiring them to be on the go all the time. They felt terrible about leaving Liam with his grandpa, but they knew it was for his best. Despite his best efforts, Mr. Miller's health was deteriorating, and he was finding it more and harder to keep up with the active child. It seems like this call was about more than just another case to Dan. He was profoundly moved by Liam's courage, devotion, and vulnerability as he looked into his grandfather's eyes. Beyond his official role as a police officer, he felt an overwhelming need to look out for the boy's best interests. Dan struggled with his morality as he drove back to the station. By meddling in Liam's personal life, was he going too far in his duties to safeguard civilians and enforce the law? Could he have acted reasonably in informing CPS about them? He felt very uneasy in that ambiguous space. Notifying the proper authorities might result in severe consequences for Liam's parents, including the possibility that he may be taken from their care. He chose to consult with Captain Laura Bennett, a lady he held in high esteem for her compassion and knowledge, for advice. With a worried tone in his voice, Dan described the scenario. Captain Bennett said, "It's a tough one, Dan," as she sank into her chair and scowled. "It is a murky area. I agree with you. On the other hand, you're a fantastic judge of character and have a kind soul. Someone has a responsibility to take action if they think this youngster is in danger. There are instances when the system is necessary to guarantee the protection of a kid, notwithstanding its imperfections." Dan reached out to CPS with the backing of his captain. He went into depth about what he had seen, highlighting how vulnerable Liam was and how dangerous his position may be. Specifically, he brought attention to Mr. Miller's deteriorating health and his failure to adequately supervise a hyperactive 3-year-old. Additionally, he brought up the incident involving the kitchen, when Liam's enthusiasm for lending a hand almost caused the kitchen to catch fire. Mr. Miller and Liam were visited in the hospital the next day by a social worker called Emily Carter. Dan, whose thoughts were jumbled with contradictory emotions, eagerly awaited word. Even though he had done the right thing, he couldn't escape the remorse and the worry that he had permanently damaged this family's lives. Emily called Dan later that day. "We appreciate you alerting us to this, Officer Hayes. After reviewing the details, we have decided to provide the family some assistance. To make sure Liam's needs are taken care of, we will also be collaborating with Mr. and Mrs. Miller. In order to help Mr. Miller manage his health and provide Liam proper monitoring, we are providing him with home health care support. While the Millers are gone, we will also be in touch with them to arrange for childcare." Dan let out a relieved breath. By assisting in making sure Liam would get the treatment he needed, he had maybe averted a catastrophe. He had gone above and beyond the call of duty to positively impact the lives of a youngster. Even though Mr. Miller was in the hospital getting well, Dan couldn't help but think about Elm Avenue. Occasionally, he would bring a bag of groceries or a little toy for Liam when he would swing by after his shift. He discovered that Liam longed for his parents and had a soft spot for superheroes and dinosaurs. Dan learned that Liam was an energetic, curious, and brilliant youngster who needed plenty of love and attention. Dan discovered an unexpected source of happiness in his time spent with Liam, despite his lack of parental experience. He told him bedtime tales with dramatic flair, showed him how to toss a baseball in the backyard, and helped him construct a spectacular fort in the living room using blankets and chairs. He even brought the youngster to the station, where he sat in the patrol vehicle, tried on hats, and met other policemen who were fascinated by the boy's boundless energy. Dan seems to be adored by Liam. His face would light up with a grin that could melt even the coldest heart as he hurried to welcome him at the door. His day, his toys, and his ambitions to be a fireman who rescued cats from trees would fill his incessant speech. As Dan regaled him with sanitized tales from his days on patrol, he would even inquire about Dan's profession, his eyes wide with curiosity. These visits were something that Dan looked forward to. In contrast to the drudgery of his profession, Liam's purity of heart and boundless energy were like a fresh breeze. He felt a connection with the youngster that transcended his role as a police officer, and he knew it was happening. Dan came upon a framed portrait on the mantelpiece one day while visiting Liam. In it, a younger Mr. Miller held a blue-blanketed infant and smiled with joy. "Liam, is that you?" With an arrow pointing to the picture, Dan inquired about the subject. A nod from Liam indicated agreement. "I cried a lot when I was a baby," according to Grandpa. After looking at the picture, Dan acted. Just as he had seen love in Mr. Miller's eyes, he could see it in Liam's when he gazed at his grandpa. A love that had no bounds, no matter how great the distance or how difficult the circumstances, tied this family together in unbreakable attachment. The thought of returning to his familiar surroundings and being constantly accompanied by his adored grandson brightened Mr. Miller's emotions as his health recovered and he was allowed to return home. Dan persisted in his visits. As he assisted Mr. Miller with household tasks such as repairing a dripping faucet, cutting the overgrown yard, and hanging new drapes, he became engrossed in their intimate and loving world. While he and Liam were playing, he constructed magnificent Lego castles, drew amazing animals, and had epic dinosaur battles. He enjoyed sharing meals with them, listening to Mr. Miller reminisce about his youth and Mrs. Miller's mouth-watering casseroles. In a world where everything seemed to be changing all the time, Dan became an anchor in their life, providing stability and support. On bright days, it was him who would take Liam to the park and push him on the swings until he squealed with delight. Bandaging Liam's wounded knees and soothing his nightmares were both done by him. As Mr. Miller expressed his concerns about his health and his dreams for Liam's future, he was the one who listened attentively. As Dan sat down to supper with Liam and Mr. Miller one night, Captain Bennett called. A jewelry business in Riverton was the victim of a break-in. Everybody has to pitch in. Am I asking too much? Despite his regret at having to go so suddenly, Dan assured Liam he would return soon to share the thrilling story of how the diamond thieves were capsized. Dan felt guilty as he drove towards the site of the crime, his police car's bright lights bouncing off the damp tarmac. The peaceful nights spent with Liam and Mr. Miller had become routine for him. He had come to enjoy their company and the sense of being valued and needed. He felt a strong connection with them and could sense that they felt the same way about him. There was more complexity to the jewelry shop situation than first anticipated. Dan spent a lot of time investigating a spate of robberies that occurred around the county, which required him to investigate leads, question suspects, and analyze evidence. He hardly had time to see Liam and Mr. Miller as days stretched into weeks. His voice betrayed his remorse as he contacted them often to check in and explain his absence. It took weeks of relentless inquiry, but at last, the case was solved. We were able to retrieve the stolen valuables and capture the perpetrators. Dan hurried to Elm Avenue, relieved but exhausted, to visit Liam and Mr. Miller, to tell them about his victory, and to reassure them that he was back. They were seated at a tiny table by the window, playing checkers, when he entered the living room. As soon as Liam laid eyes on Dan, he sprung to his feet and dashed over to embrace him, his delight evident on his face. "Hello, Dan!" With a close embrace, he yelled out. "You returned!" In return for his embrace, Dan felt a wave of comfort wash over him, dispelling the fatigue and residual stress from the case. He longed for this again, for the sense of purpose, of belonging, of being indispensable. After a few weeks of their long business trip, Liam's parents came back. Dan decided to step back from their lives for a while since he was worried about their reactions to his interference. To avoid Elm Avenue and concentrate on his job, while attempting to ignore the aching loneliness that had taken up residence in his heart, he avoided going there. He reassured himself that he had fulfilled his responsibility, that Liam was in good hands, and that he should now withdraw. It was impossible for Dan to shake the need that he felt whenever he thought about Liam, his contagious laughter, his sunny disposition, and the way he would sprint to embrace him. The dispatcher called Dan one afternoon while he was out on patrol. At the station, you may see Mr. and Mrs. Miller and Officer Hayes. "They want to see you," they say. A little beat skipped Dan's heart. To him, they were obvious. With nerves and excitement swirling in his gut, he drove to the station. If they were angry at his participation or intended to accuse him of crossing limits, he didn't know what they wanted. He discovered Liam's parents patiently waiting for him in the reception area. The pair wore nice clothes and had expressions of both thankfulness and shame on their faces. With crimson rims around her eyes, Mrs. Miller held a bouquet of flowers. A hand was offered by Mr. Miller. "We wanted to thank you for everything you've done for our son and my father," stated the man. To this, Mrs. Miller said, "We can't thank you enough. We were so worried about Liam, about my father, that we were relieved to know that someone like you would look after him while we were away." Her voice quivered with emotion as she spoke. It caught Dan off guard. Instead of the animosity he had anticipated, he received expressions of thanks and admiration. He said, "It was my pleasure," as a flush spread across his cheeks. It was unusual for someone to express gratitude for his work, much less for something so intimate and meaningful to him. "Liam constantly brings you up in conversation," Mrs. Miller said, her voice barely audible over her sobs. "He calls you his hero. He says you're the bravest, strongest, and kindest man he knows." Emotion filled Dan's heart. The words said by Liam's mother bestowed a feeling of honor and determination onto him. He had never before seen himself as a hero. Realizing he had made a positive impact on this child's life was more satisfying than receiving any kind of recognition. Liam's parents justified their frequent business travels by saying they had to in order to provide their kid a better life. Their profession required continual attention and extensive travel, but they were both successful business people. "We've always felt awful about leaving Liam with his grandpa," Mr. Miller acknowledged, his voice betraying his feelings of sorrow. "But we thought it was the best option for him." The fact that they had been ignoring Liam's psychological requirements was, however, admitted. Their drive and desire to offer financial comfort caused them to lose sight of their son's youth, and they felt a twinge of regret for missing out on those irretrievable moments. Mr. Miller said, his voice quivering slightly, "That we neglected to be present in Liam's present because we were so occupied with creating a future for Liam." Tears welling up in Mrs. Miller's eyes, she nodded. "We saw the reports from the social worker, and we had a long, hard look at ourselves. We realized that we were failing our son. We were so caught up in our own world that we didn't see how lonely he was, how much he needed us. They had made a conscious decision to put their family's needs above their own and take a break from their professional life. The couple vowed to spend less time apart, be better parents, and be more involved in Liam's life. They were also thinking about putting him in a daycare so he could meet other kids and get the one-on-one attention he required. Our goal is to be the parents that Liam truly deserves," Mrs. Miller said with unwavering resolve. "We want to be there for him, to share his joys and sorrows, to watch him grow and learn. We want to be a family." Their honesty and openness to change left a lasting impression on Dan, who listened intently. He promised Liam and Mr. Miller his undivided friendship and assistance, rather than that of a social worker or police officer. He felt a sense of relief as he departed from the station. He was grateful to have had even a little role in reuniting this family. He had made it more likely that Liam would get the care and attention he required and maybe averted a disaster. He had gone above and beyond the call of duty to positively impact the lives of a youngster. Dan couldn't help but think about Elm Avenue as Mr. Miller got better at home. He kept dropping either food or little presents for Liam. Things he found out about Liam were his love of dinosaurs and superheroes, as well as his persistent longing for his parents. Dan learned that Liam was an energetic, curious, and brilliant youngster who needed plenty of love and attention. Dan gained a new sense of purpose and satisfaction via his friendship with Liam. He started volunteering and mentoring troubled youths after his experiences with Liam, and Mr. Miller encouraged him to do so, sharing stories from his own life, providing advice, and assisting young people as they face the inevitable difficulties of puberty were all aspects of his work with youth that he found rewarding. As a beloved friend and honorary uncle, Dan maintained regular visits with Liam and his family. He was captivated by Liam's inquisitiveness, limitless energy, and maturing character as he saw him grow. He was there for them through thick and thin, sharing in their happiness and sadness, celebrating birthdays, and providing solace when sick. Dan had been changed by his time with Liam. In addition to his duties as a police officer, he now played the role of father figure, friend, and mentor. He had realized the significance of empathy, the value of relationships, and the transformative force of love. He came to see that being strong was about more than simply having power or being physically strong. It was also about being compassionate, helpful, and understanding. Sat on the porch with Mr. Miller one evening, Dan felt a wave of happiness rush over him as he watched Liam chase fireflies in the backyard, their laughing resonating in the dusk. He had discovered a home, a calling, and a clan. His expression betrayed his years, but he couldn't help but beam with delight as he met Mr. Miller's gaze. A present he hadn't asked for had transformed his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. A home, a family, and a purpose had been created for him. His heart had been mended, and his life had taken a new path, because he had discovered a love that went beyond biological ties. A love that had sprung from an act of compassion. Have you ever seen a courageous person's actions have a profound impact on another person's life? Post a comment telling us.